I survived 3 days locked in my own bathroom by the son I raised, and when I crawled out, the deed to his house was waiting in my purse. That's not the kind of sentence any woman ever imagines she'll have to say out loud, but I speak it with a voice both trembling and steady, because it is the truth of what happened to me. My name is Rosa. I am 67 years old. I've got hands that know the work of caregiving, and a back that still remembers the weight of the patients I lifted during my years as a nurse's aide. And I am a black woman from Georgia who thought the worst battles in life were behind me. I never thought I would be humiliated and discarded like trash by my own flesh and blood, the boy I once rocked to sleep, the man who should have been my protector in my old age. I never thought that the same child whose fevers I prayed over, whose knees I bandaged, whose report cards I stuck on the refrigerator door with magnets, would one day shove me into a bathroom and turn the key on me like I was some intruder in his life. Yet that is exactly how the story began. It is difficult to describe what it feels like when the click of a lock becomes the only sound in the world. At first you think it is a mistake, a cruel joke that will be undone in a minute or two, but minutes stretch into hours, and hours bleed into days, and every creak of the pipes and every shadow slipping under the door begins to feel like an insult. I knocked. I pleaded. I reminded him of who I was, but there was no answer, except the muffled sound of music and laughter floating down the hallway, the echo of glasses clinking, and the sound of his friends enjoying themselves in my house while I sat on the cold tile floor, thirsty and lightheaded, pressing my back against the door and wondering if I would live to see daylight again. I drank water from the tap. I wrapped my arms around myself when the nights got cold, and I forced my mind to stay awake by reciting every hymn my grandmother ever taught me. I am not a woman unused to hardship, but it is one thing to battle poverty, to battle racism, to battle loneliness. It is something else entirely to battle the knowledge that your own son thinks of you as an obstacle he can shove into darkness whenever you inconvenience him. In those hours, I remembered my past like a slideshow. The shifts at the hospital where I cleaned bedpans and changed sheets because no one else wanted to do it. The back-breaking double shifts that paid for his school clothes. The years when I skipped doctor's appointments because every dime went to rent and food. I remembered the promises I made to myself that if I just worked hard enough, prayed faithfully enough, maybe I could protect him from the ugliness of the world. Maybe he would grow into a man who stood tall and decent. Maybe he would love me enough to see me as more than a wallet with wrinkles. That is what I thought motherhood would buy me. Instead, I found myself in a bathroom that smelled of old soap and damp towels, counting cracks in the linoleum to pass the time, listening to my knees scream in pain every time I tried to stand. The first night was the hardest because the fear was sharp and fresh. By the second day, the fear dulled into rage. Rage is what kept me alive. I whispered to myself, "You will not die in here, Rosa. You will not let him write the end of your story." I thought of all the women I knew in church, sisters who whispered about children who cursed them, children who stole their social security checks, children who only called when they needed money. We do not like to talk about it, because the world already thinks so little of black mothers, but it is the quiet epidemic in our communities, being used, being discarded, being locked away in plain sight. I was one of those women now, pressed against a door, praying my bladder would hold, praying my heart would not give out in the middle of the night. And yet, when the door finally opened on the third day, it was not him dragging me into light. It was me stepping out on my own 2 feet. My legs were shaking, my throat dry, but I was still standing. He looked at me with that same bored expression he had worn since his teenage years, like my presence was an inconvenience. like he had done me some favor by letting me out. He muttered something about teaching me a lesson, as if he had the right to discipline the woman who birthed him. But I barely heard him, because my hands were on my purse, and inside that purse, folded neatly, as if placed by an unseen hand, was the deed to his house. My breath caught in my chest as I read my own name printed on that paper, the same paper he must have meant to tuck away somewhere safe after one of his shady financial games. It was in my bag now, mine to keep, mine to wield. It is a strange thing to emerge from 3 days of captivity and find that you are holding the very weapon that can turn the tables. At that moment, I felt two things at once. The fragile trembling of a woman who had been humiliated, starved, and nearly broken, and the fierce pulse of a woman who knew God had placed a crack in the wall of her prison and handed her a way out. I looked up at my son, his expensive shirt half-buttoned, his eyes red from whatever he had been drinking, and I realized I did not need to scream at him. I did not need to claw or curse. I had the paper, I had the proof, and I had the will. For the first time in years, the balance of power tilted just a little back toward me. So this is where the story truly begins. A 67-year-old black woman, betrayed by the child she gave her whole life to, stepping out of the shadows of a locked bathroom with a crumpled deed in her hands. I was still weak, still shaking, but I was no longer helpless. The humiliation he thought would silence me had only sharpened me, and though he did not yet know it, the house he bragged about, the house where he thought he ruled like a king, was already slipping from his grasp into my control. And if there is one thing a woman like me learns after decades of survival, it is that once the door is open, you never let yourself be locked away again. When people ask what the breaking point is between ordinary family tension and the kind of cruelty that leaves scars, I can tell them exactly. It was the moment my son stood in the hallway, looking at me as though I were a stranger who had trespassed into his home, and told me that locking me in the bathroom for 3 days was necessary, so I would finally learn my place. His tone was flat, not even angry, as if I were an unruly child who had been punished and now released. And I realized then that in his mind I was no longer a mother, no longer a human being, but an obstacle to be managed, silenced, and reduced. That was the catalyst for everything that followed, because once a woman like me understands that she is not seen as worthy of dignity by her own child, something in her spirit shifts, and there is no turning back. I remember the way he leaned against the wall, arms folded across his chest, his phone still in his hand, scrolling through messages, barely looking at me while I tried to find my balance outside the bathroom. He did not ask if I had eaten, did not offer me a glass of water, did not even acknowledge the fact that I smelled of stale air and sweat after 3 days of confinement. Instead, he told me that I should be grateful, because he could have called the police and told them I was unstable. He could have had me placed in a facility where I would rot among strangers. He said it with the casual cruelty of someone who has learned that power can make lies feel like truth if you repeat them enough times. I had heard echoes of that tone before, in the way certain doctors dismissed my pain when I was younger, or the way supervisors told me to be quiet when I reported harassment on the job. But to hear it in my own hallway, from the mouth of my son, pierced me deeper than anything else. That day, I kept my mouth shut, not because I was defeated, but because I understood something vital. Survival sometimes depends on silence, on holding your cards close until the right moment comes. The document in my purse weighed like a secret stone, reminding me that his arrogance had left a crack in his armor. I nodded as if I were ashamed, as if I had learned the lesson he claimed to teach, and shuffled back toward my room. Inside, though, my mind was already calculating. I knew enough about paperwork and signatures to recognize what I held. His name was no longer on the deed, mine was. Whether by accident or desperation, he had transferred ownership, and that meant that beneath his threats, beneath his cruelty, I had leverage. That evening, I sat quietly in my bedroom, listening to the noise of his friends filling the house, their laughter spilling through the thin walls, their music rattling the pictures on the shelves. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who worked overtime to buy him sneakers and sent him to school with lunch money tucked into his pocket, the one who baked sweet potato pies at Thanksgiving so he would never feel poor, even when we barely had heat. That woman was gone. The new woman, the one clutching a deed to the very roof over his head, understood that sometimes God delivers justice in strange and unexpected packages. The catalyst moment grew sharper the next morning when he walked into the kitchen, yawning, and told me that from now on he would be handling all of my affairs. He said my retirement checks would go into his account because I was too old to keep track of numbers, and he laughed at the idea that I might object. That laugh told me everything. He truly believed I was trapped, that I had no options, that without him I was powerless. He did not see the fire in my eyes because he did not bother to look, and he did not see the document I had hidden because he did not think I was capable of hiding anything. In his arrogance, he revealed his entire plan. Take my money, take my voice, and keep me confined under the roof that, unknown to him, no longer legally belonged to him. For the first time in years, I felt something rise in me that had been buried by decades of servitude and exhaustion. It was not just anger, but clarity. I thought about every woman I knew in church who whispered about children using them for checks and then leaving them alone on Sundays. Every woman who clutched her purse tight because she knew her son or daughter might steal the $20 bill, folded inside. I thought about the stories I had heard of grandmothers being pressured into signing away houses, only to be left homeless. And I thought about my mother's voice, stern but loving, saying, "Rosa, don't you ever let anybody write your ending but you." That memory became my anchor, so the catalyst was not only his cruelty, but also my discovery that the tools of his control could be turned against him. The paper in my purse was not just paper. It was proof that he was vulnerable, proof that he had overreached, proof that God had given me a key while I was still in the dark. I held that thought close, feeding it like a flame, letting it warm me when the house felt like a prison. I played my part, quiet and compliant, while my mind sharpened with every passing hour. He thought I was broken, but I was preparing. When he boasted to his friends that he was the man of the house, when he strutted around in his pressed shirts and talked about the business deals he never quite managed to close, I watched with calm eyes. He believed he was invincible, but I knew different. The real catalyst was not his violence, not even my suffering, but the knowledge that for the first time in years, I had power too. That knowledge is what transformed me from victim to survivor, from silent mother to strategist. And as I sat at the kitchen table that night, sipping water and staring at the deed tucked safely in my pocket, I made myself a promise. He might have locked me in the bathroom, but he would never lock me away again. He might think he was teaching me a lesson, but the lesson I had learned was far greater. That the very chains he used to hold me could become the rope I would climb to freedom. I remember the morning when the air in the house shifted, when the quiet despair I had carried in my chest hardened into a different kind of resolve. Because that was the morning I finally dared to unfold the document fully, to smooth out its creases across my lap, and to study each line with the eyes of a woman who had spent her whole life paying bills, signing time cards, and negotiating with landlords who never thought twice about raising the rent. I had always been careful with paperwork. I may not have gone to college, but I knew the weight of signatures and stamps, the way one piece of paper could mean the difference between having a roof over your head and standing outside with nowhere to. Go? As I read the words on that deed, my own name spelled out in bold letters where his should have been, something inside me stirred, something old and fierce that I had almost forgotten. My heart beat heavy against my ribs, not with fear this time, but with recognition that I was no longer as powerless as he thought. That was the true beginning of the first escalation, the moment when the private knowledge of my suffering started to transform into the seed of an open battle. The house was quiet that morning, my son still asleep after another night of drinking with his friends, the kind of friends who laughed too loudly and left beer bottles scattered across the counters as if the home belonged to them. I took the document and placed it carefully inside a manila folder I found in the bottom drawer of my desk, one I used to keep old tax returns and doctor's notes. I slid the folder under a stack of church newsletters, because I knew he never cared to look at anything that smelled of responsibility or faith. Then I dressed myself slowly, put on my thickest coat, and walked out into the cold air with the excuse of going to the grocery store. My knees ached, and my head still swam from the 3 days locked in that suffocating bathroom. But I walked with a determination I had not felt in years, carrying not just my handbag, but the weight of the choice I was about to make. I was going to the bank. Inside the branch, the warmth of the heaters and the smell of coffee felt like another world compared to the gloom of my house. I asked to speak with a manager, a man I had known for years, from cashing checks and paying bills. His name was Mr. Cummings, a soft-spoken gentleman with glasses and silver hair, and when I showed him the deed and whispered my fears, he did not laugh or dismiss me. Instead, he adjusted his glasses, read the lines slowly, and said with careful authority that yes, this document was valid, and yes, it meant the property was in my name. I must have looked shocked, because he leaned forward and explained how people in financial trouble sometimes shuffle assets, transferring ownership to relatives to avoid creditors, and in his rush or his arrogance, my son had signed the deed over to me without even realizing the full implications. Mr. Cummings warned me that the house was entangled in debts, that banks and collectors would come knocking soon. But he also said something that made my chest swell with cautious pride. "Mrs. Johnson, right now you are the legal owner. That means you have more power than you think." I walked out of that bank with a mixture of fear and exhilaration, because the truth of my situation had just doubled in weight. On the one hand, my son's cruelty had placed me in the crosshairs of his creditors. On the other hand, he had handed me the one weapon I could use to break free from him. I could feel the paper in my purse like a living thing, each step echoing with the knowledge that what had been intended as a tool of manipulation could be transformed into a shield. My son had wanted to strip me of dignity, to make me into a silent servant in his house, but he had instead handed me the very foundation beneath his feet. That night, as he sat with a glass of whiskey in hand, bragging loudly on the phone to someone about a big deal that was going to come through, I stayed in the shadows of the kitchen doorway, watching him, seeing him not as the untouchable figure he pretended to be, but as a man who had already dug himself into a hole so deep he didn't even know the ground had shifted. He kept repeating the phrase, "my house," as if it were a magic spell, as if saying it enough times could make it true. Each time he said it, I whispered to myself, "No, it's mine," letting the words roll across my tongue like a secret incantation. The escalation deepened when I decided to test the strength of my newfound leverage. I called the utility company the next day, just to ask about the account, pretending to be confused about a bill. And when the woman on the phone asked me to verify my identity, I gave her my name, the name that was now on the deed, and without hesitation she addressed me as the homeowner. In that simple exchange, my reality shifted further. The world beyond our four walls acknowledged me, not him. and that acknowledgement tasted sweeter than anything I had known in years. Still, I had to play carefully. He was unpredictable, volatile, and more dangerous than ever, because deep down he probably sensed that I was no longer the beaten-down woman he had controlled for so long. He began to watch me more closely, questioning where I went, mocking me when I came home with grocery bags, and muttering that I was spending his money when I bought even the smallest necessities. The irony was bitter, because the truth he did not know was that nothing in that house was his anymore. The legal lines had been redrawn, and though he still strutted around like a king, he was a king living on borrowed land. The first escalation also revealed itself in my own body. I started sleeping with the deed under my pillow, afraid that if he ever discovered it, he would destroy it. And I began writing down everything that had happened to me. The days locked in the bathroom, the bruises on my wrists from pounding on the door, the cruel words he had spoken. I wrote it all in a notebook I kept hidden behind the cleaning supplies, a place I knew he would never look. Writing it down gave me strength, reminded me that my story mattered, that I was not invisible. It also gave me evidence, a paper trail of truth that no one could dismiss as the ramblings of an old woman. And then came the night when he held a dinner party, filling the living room with people dressed in suits and dresses too flashy for the modest walls of the house. I sat quietly at the edge of the room, serving plates, refilling glasses, listening to the way he boasted about his success, about the deals he claimed to have in motion, about the security of his property. He looked around at the guests with that smug smile that had become his mask, and I clenched my fists under the tablecloth. The escalation reached a visible peak when one of the guests, a man with too much cologne and a laugh like breaking glass, leaned back in his chair and joked, "Careful, son. What if your mama decides to put you out of here one day?" The room erupted with laughter, but not mine. I held my breath as my son froze for half a second, his jaw tightening, his eyes flicking toward me with a flash of suspicion and anger. That single moment confirmed what I already knew. The power dynamic between us had shifted, even if he couldn't quite put his finger on why. I went to bed that night, trembling, not from fear, but from the electric knowledge that the battle lines had been drawn. I was no longer a silent victim, hiding in the corners of my own home. I was a woman holding the deed, a woman whose silence had become strategy, and a woman preparing for a confrontation that would only grow louder. The first escalation was not just about paperwork or whispered secrets. It was about the awakening of a will that had been buried under years of sacrifice, disappointment, and betrayal. I realized that my son's cruelty had created his own undoing, and I was determined to see it through. The deed was more than a document. It was a lifeline, a weapon, and a promise that my story would not end in a locked bathroom. It was the beginning of a fight for dignity that I intended to win, no matter how long it took or how dangerous the road became. I did not fully understand the meaning of a turning point until the evening when the walls of that house, the house I now knew to be legally mine, became a stage for his pride and my quiet resistance. Because that was the night when everything in our struggle shifted from whispers in my head to a battle that could no longer remain hidden. It began simply enough with him announcing that he was hosting an important dinner, the kind of gathering he believed would elevate him in the eyes of the people he wanted to impress. Men with shallow eyes, and women with laughter that cut through the air like glass. People who never saw me as anything more than an old woman moving silently between the kitchen and the dining room, with plates balanced in my aching hands. He strutted around the house that day like he owned the sun itself, barking orders at me to polish the silverware, to dust the shelves, to cook more food than a dozen mouths could ever finish, as though I were hired help rather than the woman who had birthed him, and who, unbeknownst to him, held the paper that made me the true owner of every inch of the space he paraded in. As I worked in the kitchen, stirring pots and arranging dishes, my mind was not on the recipes, but on the weight of the deed hidden in my dresser drawer upstairs. I thought about how strange it was to cook and serve under the roof that was mine, yet to remain invisible in my own home. My anger simmered along with the collard greens. My patience stretched thin as the cornbread rose in the oven. But I bit my tongue and kept my hands steady, because I knew the moment to reveal my truth had not yet arrived. Still, I could feel something gathering inside me, a storm building, and I understood that this dinner might not unfold the way he intended. When the guests arrived, their voices filled the rooms, loud and careless, their laughter bouncing off the walls while they poured drinks and praised him for his supposed successes. He wore a suit too expensive for his debts, and he moved with the false confidence of a man who believes his lies are stronger than the truth waiting to crush him. I moved quietly between them, carrying trays, clearing glasses, my body aching but my ears wide open, catching every word he spoke about deals, investments, and future plans. He used phrases like "my empire" and "my house," each time stressing ownership as if saying it often enough would make it real. I clenched my jaw, pressing down the words that wanted to escape, because it was not yet time to reveal the reality that his empire was built on sand and that the foundation beneath his feet no longer belonged to him. The moment that became the midpoint of everything came not from me, but from one of his guests, a man with a booming laugh who was halfway through his third glass of whiskey when he leaned back in his chair, pointed toward me as I set down a platter, and said with a grin, "What would you do if your mama here decided to toss you out one day?" The room erupted in laughter, everyone enjoying the joke, except for me and my son. I froze in place, the tray trembling slightly in my hands, and in that instant the air grew heavy, the laughter fading as my son's eyes locked on mine with a look that was sharp and dangerous. He forced a smile for his guests, but I saw the flicker of fear behind his eyes, the realization that even the suggestion of my power unsettled him, and that realization was enough to ignite a fire deep in my chest. I carried the empty tray back into the kitchen, my heart pounding, because for the first time in years I had seen him falter, even if only for a breath. The balance of power had shifted slightly in that moment, and he knew it. Later, when the guests had left and the house was quiet except for the clinking of dishes as I washed them, he appeared in the doorway, his face tight with anger. He did not raise his voice, but his words carried a threat sharper than any shout. "Don't think for a second you could ever put me out of this house," he said, his tone low and venomous. "You're here because I allow it." "You wouldn't last a day without me." I did not respond. I simply dried my hands on the towel and met his gaze with a steady calm that surprised even me. Inside, though, my resolve hardened. I knew then that the war between us had truly begun, and there would be no turning back to the days when I let his cruelty go unchecked. From that night forward, the house no longer felt like a prison I endured, but like a battlefield where each move mattered. Every word, every glance, every silence was part of the struggle. I began preparing in ways he could not see, keeping records of bills, debts, and accounts, visiting the bank quietly, and confiding small truths to a neighbor who had always asked if I was all right, but to whom I had never before given an honest answer. I collected these pieces of evidence like weapons, storing them in places he would never think to search, because I knew the day would come when I would need to defend myself, not just with words, but with proof. The midpoint of the story is not only about that dinner and the joke that sliced open the illusion of his control. It is about the realization that I had crossed from survival into resistance, from silence into strategy. I no longer walked through the house with my eyes lowered. I looked at the walls, the floors, the furniture, and I thought of them as mine, because legally they were, and in my spirit they always had been. I no longer trembled when he barked orders, though I still followed some of them to keep the peace, because I knew peace was temporary and war was inevitable. He sensed the change in me. I could see it in the way his eyes lingered on me longer, searching for cracks, in the way he muttered insults under his breath with more venom than before. He knew something had shifted, even if he could not name it. In church that Sunday, as I sat among women my age who carried their own burdens of children who drained them, husbands who ignored them, and a society that erased them, I prayed silently, but not for deliverance. Instead, I prayed for strength, for patience, for wisdom to know the right time to strike. The midpoint was not about escaping. It was about choosing to stay and fight, about claiming my right to be heard, to be seen, to be respected in my own home. I walked out of that church with my head higher than it had been in years, clutching my Bible in one hand and the memory of that deed in the other, even though it never left the drawer at home. So the middle of my story was marked by a laugh at a dinner table, by a flash of fear in my son's eyes, by the quiet strength in my own gaze as I refused to shrink. It was the moment when the story turned from private humiliation to a public conflict, when the lies he told about being the man of the house began to crack under the weight of truth. It was the point of no return, the place where I stopped being a prisoner and became a fighter, where the shadows of the bathroom where he had locked me no longer defined me, but instead became the backdrop against which I would rise. And as I stood in that kitchen, drying my hands after his whispered threats, I whispered to myself, "You don't know it yet, but your time here is running out." It happened so suddenly that I almost believed for a moment I had slipped into someone else's nightmare, because even after everything he had already done to me, I still carried some small, foolish hope that he would not cross certain lines. But cruelty has no ceiling once a man convinces himself that his own mother is expendable. And I realized that the night he tried to erase me with a single staged performance. I had gone to the store earlier that day, my body heavy with the fatigue of secrets and plans. And when I returned home, I found the living room strangely tidy, the bottles and clutter gone, the air unnervingly still. He was sitting on the sofa in silence, his phone in his hand, his eyes sharp and cold. He looked at me with the kind of calculation I had seen in gamblers at the racetrack when I was younger, men about to risk everything on one last throw, and before I could ask what was wrong, he smiled in a way that chilled me to the bone. That night, he shoved me near the staircase with enough force that I stumbled backward, landing hard against the steps, my hips screaming in pain. And before I could gather myself, he was already on the phone, his voice full of fake concern as he told the emergency dispatcher that his elderly mother had fallen again, that she was confused, that he feared she might be a danger to herself. I lay there clutching my side, my breath shallow, and understood with a terrible clarity that he was no longer satisfied with locking me away. Now he wanted to brand me insane. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights hummed above me while a young doctor in a white coat asked questions in a slow, deliberate tone, as though I were a child who could barely understand English. My son stood beside him, his arm draped protectively across my shoulders in a grotesque parody of care, feeding the doctor a story about my supposed confusion, my forgetfulness, my instability. He told them I had wandered at night, that I forgot how to cook, that I imagined people who were not there. I sat there, listening to his lies, biting the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood, because I knew if I shouted the truth in that moment, they would see only the picture he had painted. An old black woman who had lost her grip on reality, dependent on her son for shelter and safety. That was the injustice of it. that the very systems designed to protect could so easily be twisted into weapons, especially against women like me, who carried the double weight of age and race in a society that often looked the other way when we cried for help. But what he did not know, what gave me strength in the sterile chill of that hospital room, was that I had come prepared. I had the document tucked safely away in my purse back at the house, a paper shield he could not erase, and on my phone, hidden beneath the list of church contacts, was a short audio clip I had recorded in the bathroom when he thought I was too broken to resist. His voice was clear in that recording, sneering that he would lock me in again if I didn't learn my place. Words sharp enough to cut through any mask he tried to wear. And I also had something more powerful than paperwork or recordings. I had a neighbor who had heard my cries through the thin walls on those long nights. A woman willing to testify that I had been held against my will. These were the truths I carried like weapons, though I kept them sheathed for now, because the fight would not be won in that hospital. They sent me home the next day with a pamphlet about fall prevention and a warning to take it easy. And he smirked all the way back in the car, convinced he had tightened his grip on me. He told me in a low voice that I should be careful, that the next time he might have me committed for good, that no one would believe my word over his. I turned my face to the window and watched the streets roll by, my reflection pale but steady in the glass, and I promised myself that if he wanted war, then war was what he would receive. It was not just about survival anymore. It was about dignity, about the right to exist in truth rather than in the prison of his lies. Back at the house, I lay in my bed, my hip still aching from the fall, staring at the ceiling and feeling the weight of exhaustion press down on me. But beneath that weight was steel, a hard core that his betrayal had forged. The injustice of that night became my fuel. The knowledge that he would stoop so low as to weaponize the system against me gave me a clarity sharper than any sermon. He had revealed his plan in full, and by trying to erase me, he had written his own undoing. I would not crumble under the label he tried to force onto me. I would rise with my evidence, my witnesses, my truth, and when the time came, I would show the world who he really was. The weeks that followed became a different kind of battle altogether, one that no longer lived only in the shadows of my heart, but began to take shape in the world outside. Because I understood that if I did not move swiftly and carefully, he would succeed in twisting the story until I disappeared beneath his lies. He had already tried to paint me as unstable, already tested the waters with doctors and nurses who did not know me, and I could see in his eyes the hunger of a man who believed he could manipulate every system the same way he manipulated me. That was when I realized that my survival depended not only on my silence, but on my preparation, on turning every scrap of truth I had into evidence strong enough to stand against his performance. I began to document everything with a kind of obsessive discipline, writing down dates, times, and words in the notebook I kept hidden behind the bleach bottles, snapping photos of bruises with the cheap phone he thought was too complicated for me to use, and saving every bill and receipt that showed where the money flowed. I turned my suffering into a ledger, every mark on my skin and every cruel remark he muttered becoming another entry in the case I was building brick by brick. One of the most important shifts happened with my neighbour, Miss Daniels, a widow in her 70s who lived next door and who had always been kind enough to bring me leftover pound cake or ask if I needed help carrying groceries. For months, I had brushed off her concern, ashamed of admitting what was happening inside my house. But one afternoon, while he was away pretending to negotiate some business, I sat at her kitchen table and poured the truth out like a river breaking through a dam. She listened without interrupting, her eyes soft but steady, and when I finished, she reached across the table, squeezed my hand, and said she had heard more than once the sounds of shouting and crying through the thin walls, that she had worried, but did not want to intrude. When I asked if she would be willing to tell the truth if someone in authority asked her, she nodded without hesitation. And in that moment, I felt less alone than I had in years. Her willingness to stand with me gave me courage, because I knew that in a world that often dismissed the voices of black women, our words carried more weight when echoed by another. At the same time, I made another quiet but crucial move. I went back to the bank to see Mr. Cummings, bringing with me the deed and asking what protections I could put in place. He explained that as the legal owner, I had the right to file certain documents that would prevent him from selling or mortgaging the house behind my back, and though the process was complicated, he guided me patiently, filling out forms and making copies that I stored in a folder marked with my own name in bold letters. Walking out of that building with the stamped papers in my hand, I felt taller than I had in years, my spine straight, even though my knees still ached, because I knew I had created another layer of defense between myself and the trap he was trying to set. The escalation took on a sharper edge the night he accused me again of losing my mind, this time in front of his wife and two of her friends who had come for dinner. He dropped hints about my forgetfulness, smirked as he suggested I could no longer manage the simplest household tasks, and laughed as if it were a harmless joke. But I saw the way his wife glanced at me, uncertain, and I saw the way her friends exchanged looks. That night, I did not argue, but after they left, I went to my room, pulled out the audio recording I had hidden on my phone, and listened to his own voice threatening me, the venom in his tone undeniable. I knew then that the moment to remain passive had ended, that it was time to bring others into the fight, people who could protect me when he tried again to weaponize the system. I reached out to a legal aid service run by the church downtown, where volunteers offered advice to seniors who were being mistreated by family. I remember sitting in that small office, clutching my purse as though it were armor, and telling my story to a young black attorney who listened with a seriousness that made tears sting my eyes. She explained to me that I could file for an order of protection, that I could press charges for unlawful imprisonment, that the deed in my name meant I had the power to evict him legally if I chose. The words sounded too powerful to be real, but she laid out the steps, and I realized that the mountain in front of me was not as impossible as I had believed. She told me the most important thing was documentation, witnesses, and courage, and I nodded because those were exactly the things I had begun to gather. Meanwhile, his behavior grew more desperate. He rifled through my drawers when he thought I was not watching, questioned me about where I went during the day, and one night even accused me of stealing from him when he could not find the bottle of whiskey he had hidden in the cabinet. His paranoia was the mirror of my own secret work, a sign that on some level he knew his control was slipping. He threatened again to have me declared incompetent, to call the police and say I was violent, but each time he spoke, I felt less fear and more determination. I began to answer him with silence so steady it unnerved him, because silence can be louder than shouting when it is filled with purpose. The escalation reached another peak when he confronted me with papers one evening, documents he claimed would make things easier for both of us. He said it was just a power of attorney, just something to help manage my affairs since I was getting older. But when I looked at the lines of text, I saw the trap clearly. Signing those papers would have given him full control over everything I owned, every account, every decision, every right. I smiled softly, pretended to be confused, and told him I would look at them later. As soon as he left the room, I slid the documents into my bag and took them the next morning straight to the legal aid attorney, who confirmed exactly what I suspected. That moment became another weapon in my arsenal, proof that his intentions were not care but theft, evidence I could use when the inevitable confrontation spilled into court. Every day the tension in the house thickened, Every night I went to bed with the deed under my pillow and my phone on the charger beside me. Every morning I woke up determined to add another piece to the case I was building. The house felt less like a home and more like a war room, but I did not shrink from it. Instead, I drew strength from the small victories. The neighbor who promised to speak, the banker who stood by his word, the attorney who believed me, the recordings that captured his cruelty in his own voice. For the first time in years, I felt like I was not simply enduring, but actively fighting. And though the danger had never been greater, neither had my resolve. The second escalation was not loud or dramatic, like the first time he locked me in that bathroom. It was quiet, steady, relentless, a gathering of power that he could not see, but that grew stronger with each passing day. He thought he was tightening his grip, but what he was really doing was forcing me to sharpen my weapons, to strengthen my alliances, to transform from a victim into a woman ready to face him in the open. And I knew that when the final confrontation came, I would no longer be the trembling mother begging for mercy. I would be the rightful owner of the house, the keeper of the truth, and the woman who refused to let her story end in silence. The day of the courtroom came heavy with rain, the kind that taps against the windows like a restless hand and makes the air feel weighted with more than weather. And as I walked into that building with my cane in one hand and my folder of evidence clutched in the other, I understood with absolute clarity that everything we had endured inside those four walls was now spilling into the open. My son was already there, standing tall in a pressed suit he could not afford, his hair slicked back, his wife at his side with her face painted in a mask of pity, as though they were the victims and not me. He had that same smug smile he always wore, the one that told the world he was a man in control. But for the first time, I saw something else underneath it, a flicker of unease, because this was not his stage at home where his voice drowned mine. This was a place where my words would be heard and measured against the truth. I took my seat at the plaintiff's table, the young attorney from the legal aid service beside me, and I folded my hands in my lap to stop them from shaking, whispering a prayer that God give me the strength to speak when the time came. The proceedings began with his lawyer painting a picture of me as unstable, forgetful, a frail woman who could no longer care for herself, a woman who was prone to outbursts and dangerous to her own well-being. They spoke of the supposed fall down the stairs, of his endless sacrifice in caring for me, and of the need for the court to grant him power over my affairs for my own protection. I sat there listening to their lies weave together into a net meant to entrap me, my chest tight, but my mind calm, because I knew what was waiting in my folder, waiting to shatter that carefully built illusion. When my attorney rose, her voice was clear and steady, and she began by placing the deed on the judge's bench, the original document showing my name alone, the undeniable proof that the house belonged not to my son, but to me. The courtroom shifted then, a murmur rippling through the observers, and I saw my son's face darken as though someone had slapped him. But that was only the beginning. Piece by piece, the truth was laid bare, not by angry words, but by facts. My attorney presented the audio recording, his voice filling the silent courtroom with venom as he threatened to lock me away again, his words sharp and undeniable. She called my neighbor to the stand, and Miss Daniels testified with quiet dignity about the nights she heard me crying, the days she saw bruises on my arms, the times she feared for my safety. She spoke not as a stranger, but as a woman of the community, her words carrying the weight of someone with nothing to gain and everything to risk by telling the truth. Then came the banker, Mr. Cummings, who confirmed the legitimacy of the transfer and testified to my inquiries about protecting the property, proof that I had acted with reason and clarity, not confusion. With every witness, every piece of evidence, the false image he had constructed began to crumble, and I watched his confidence shrink until he no longer sat tall, but leaned forward, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the table. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly, my body aching, but my spirit steady, and I told the judge what had happened in my own words. I described the 3 days locked in the bathroom without food, the humiliation of being treated like a prisoner in my own home, the fear that I would die unseen and unheard. I spoke of the lies he told about my mind, the manipulation of my pension, the threats whispered in my ear when no one else was listening. I did not cry, though my voice shook at times, because I wanted my words to carry not pity, but truth. I looked at the judge, at the rows of strangers, at my son himself, and I said clearly, I am not confused. I am not unstable. I am a woman who has survived everything this world has thrown at me, and I will not be erased by the child I brought into this world. The silence that followed was heavier than any applause, and in that silence I felt the weight of decades lift from my shoulders. The climax came in the judge's ruling. A moment stretched long as we all waited, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. He spoke with measured words, acknowledging the evidence, the witnesses, the undeniable ownership of the property. And then he turned his gaze to my son and declared that his petition was not only denied, but that his actions would be referred for further investigation as potential criminal conduct. The words rang through the room like church bells, final and resonant, and in that instant I saw my son's face collapse, the mask stripped away to reveal not a powerful man, but a frightened boy caught in his own lies. Security officers moved closer to him as the gavel struck, and I closed my eyes for a brief moment, letting the sound wash over me like a hymn. Walking out of that courtroom, the rain still falling outside, I felt the air against my face like a blessing. My son was behind me, his voice raised in protest, his hands clenched as he argued with his lawyer, but he no longer had power over me. The house was mine, my dignity intact, my truth recognized not just by me, but by the world. The culmination of every sleepless night, every hidden note, every bruise documented and every prayer whispered had come to this moment, and I had not been silenced. I stepped into the rain, lifted my face to the sky, and breathed deeply, not as a prisoner, not as a victim, but as a woman who had fought her way through the storm and found the strength to stand tall once more. When the dust of the courtroom settled and the echoes of the gavel faded, I found myself walking through the world with a new kind of silence. Not the silence of fear or humiliation that had once bound my throat, but the silence of strength, the calm that comes after a storm has torn through everything and left behind the clarity of survival. The house that had once been a prison now stood before me as mine in every sense, not only by law, but by spirit. And each step I took through its rooms felt like reclaiming territory stolen from me, every doorway and window becoming a reminder that I had endured, that I had refused to vanish. The walls still carried the memories of shouting and cruelty, but they also carried my prayers, my whispered promises, and my determination. And slowly the balance shifted, so that what had been a cage began to feel like a sanctuary again. My son was gone, his belongings removed by the sheriff after the ruling made it clear he had no right to remain. And for the first time in years, I woke to the sound of my own breath instead of his voice, to the quiet of peace instead of the tension of waiting for footsteps on the stairs. I walked into the kitchen and made myself coffee without rushing, without fear of criticism, letting the rich scent fill the room like a hymn. I sat at the table, the morning light streaming across the surface where so many arguments had once taken place, and I opened my notebook, the same one where I had documented every bruise and every threat. And instead of writing down pain, I wrote down gratitude, a list of names and blessings. Miss Daniels for her courage to speak, Mr. Cummings for his integrity, the young attorney who stood beside me with unwavering belief, and even the strength inside myself that I had doubted for so long but had proven unbreakable. I knew the fight was not over entirely, because men like my son rarely accept defeat without lingering bitterness, and I knew there might be appeals or whispers in the community, but I also knew that I had the power of truth on my side. And more importantly, I had reclaimed my dignity. No matter what words he tried to spread, no matter what lies he might tell, I had faced him in the one place where truth could not be silenced, and I had walked out with my head high. That knowledge was a shield stronger than any lock or chain, and I carried it with me into every ordinary moment, from folding laundry to watering the plants by the window. The neighbours, who had once only waved politely, now greeted me with warmth, stopping to ask how I was doing, offering small gestures of kindness that reminded me. Community is not built in grand gestures, but in the daily recognition of one another's humanity. At church, the whispers of sympathy gave way to nods of respect, and several women approached me quietly to confess that they too lived under the shadow of children who drained them, who belittled them, who thought of them only as a bank or a burden. They looked at me with tears in their eyes and said my courage had given them a spark of hope, that perhaps they too could speak, could gather evidence, could refuse to be erased. I realized then that my story was no longer only my own, that by surviving and by speaking, I had opened a door for others, and that in itself was a blessing greater than the house or the legal victory. Evenings became my favorite time again. I would sit on the porch with a shawl around my shoulders, watching the sun dip behind the trees, listening to the cicadas sing. Sometimes Miss Daniels joined me, bringing over sweet tea or a slice of cake, and we would sit in companionable silence, two women who had endured much but were still here, still standing. Other times I sat alone, the deed resting safely in a drawer inside, and I would think about my mother, about the lessons she whispered when I was a girl, about the resilience she carried through her own storms. I felt her presence in those moments, as though she were nodding at me from beyond, proud that I had not allowed myself to be silenced. The scars remain, both on my body and in my spirit, but they are no longer marks of shame. They are proof that I survived, that I walked through fire and emerged not unburned, but unbroken. I know now that survival is not about avoiding pain, but about refusing to let pain define you. And as I move through each day, I remind myself that I am more than what was done to me. I am a woman who worked hard all her life, who raised a child even when the world tried to grind me down, who endured betrayal and still found the courage to fight back. That is the story I choose to carry forward, the one I will pass down if anyone ever asks what became of me. In the quiet of night, when I turn off the lights and lay my head on the pillow, I sometimes hear the faint echo of the bathroom door clicking shut, a memory that still has the power to chill me. But then I remember the sound of the judge's gavel, the weight of the deed in my hands, the look in my son's eyes when the truth was revealed, and the fear fades into resolve. I whisper to myself before sleep, "You are free. You are whole. You are never going back into that darkness." And with those words, I drift into dreams not of captivity, but of open doors, sunlight streaming through them, and the knowledge that no one will ever again lock me away in silence.